So my presentation today is kind of an introduction to all of our themes for this week. And that, as I prepared for it, I was thinking to myself, what can I say that won't be said by other presenters, right, as they go through? I'm sure I'll probably violate someone's turf before, the next 50 minutes is over. But at the very least, it'll get us thinking about the relationship that we're trying to understand here between, say, artificial intelligence on the one hand and human consciousness and reason on the other. So, here we go. In June 1988, in a letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory, St. John Paul II expressed his vision of a relational unity between religion and science, one in which, in his vision, theologians and scientists would both have leading roles. Comparing the theologians of today with those of the Middle Ages, he asserted that, like the medieval masters, like someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, theologians must understand contemporary scientific findings and test their value in bringing out from Christian belief some of the possibilities which have not yet been realized. He continued, theologians might well ask with respect to contemporary science if they have accomplished this extraordinary difficult process as well as did those medieval masters. And then he asked a hopeful question about theological anthropology. He asked, does an evolutionary perspective bring any light to bear upon theological anthropology and the meaning of the human person as imago Dei, or as the image of God? Hence the theme and contents of Capstone 2019. We've taken Pope John Paul II's question and have added a few others. Does the continued evolution of humanity have a new stage in which humanity evolves beyond itself into machines of its own making, into things that would have a claim due to reason and freedom on the privileged status that we have of being the image of God? Will computers be able to have insight in the sense that the Jesuit philosopher and theologian Bernard Lonergan so artfully and incisively described our own intellectual powers? Those questions require a deeper understanding of what the Catholic intellectual tradition teaches us about human reason, about human freedom or free will. It requires a deeper understanding of what science has contributed to our understanding of our biological heritage, the evolutionary origin of our humanity. It requires understanding consciousness, and it requires understanding artificial intelligence, right? The hope is that we can turn the questions that AI poses to us into a better understanding of human dignity and uniqueness for the sake of educating students who can do the same, who can represent the Catholic vision of the human person in our ever-advancing technological society. But there might be another and perhaps more disturbing reason, definitely more disturbing reason, for undertaking this theme, to be found in an ancient Jewish legend which came from a rabbi who wrote in southern France centuries ago in the 1200s. It is a legend about the prophet Jeremiah and his son. According to the legend, they succeeded in inventing a golem, a living man. They did it by correctly combining words and letters, in which each letter and word represented a number, much like computer scientists nowadays use numbers to create powerful programs, right? To create artificial neural networks based on those in our own brains. On the golem's forehead were the Hebrew letters that they had used to crack the riddle of creation. The words read, Yahweh is the truth. But the golem tore off one of the letters, and they were left with the inscription, God is dead. Horrified, Jeremiah and his son asked the golem why they had done this blasphemous thing, or why he had done it. He answered, now that you are able to create a man, God is dead. My life is the death of God. Where man has all the power, God no longer has any power. In his interpretation of the legend, Joseph Ratzinger captures the crisis hidden within our technological advances. Man possesses total power over the world. His knowledge is power. In a world that is completely analyzed, man can only find help in man, since it is only man who has power over the world. Since a God without power is no God, there is no longer any God where man alone possesses power. This is why we fear AI, even as we try to understand it. And I think we're right to fear it in the sense that we see, or can see, a deeper spiritual crisis lurking within the opportunities that it represents. But we can only know artificial intelligence as a crisis if we also come to know better what it means to be human. I'd like to start us out on that path by considering another reflection from Joseph Ratzinger on the uniqueness of our humanity. He begins by quoting Psalm 139, verses 1 through 12, which he sees as representing not only the biblical vision, but a common theme in the universal religious history of humanity. Throughout that history, as you all well know, God is represented as having eyes on all sides, as the act of absolute seeing. God is the one who sees. And so the human person is the one, whether she acknowledges it or not, that experiences herself as being seen by God and by other persons. So here's Psalm 139. Why don't we make this a prayer to begin our time together? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, you have probed me, and you know me. You know when I sit and stand. You understand my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, Lord, you know it all. Behind and before you encircle me and rest your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, far too lofty for me to reach. Where can I go from your spirit? From your presence, where can I flee? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I lie down in Sheol, there you are. If I take the wings of the dawn and dwell beyond the sea, even there your hand guides me. Your right hand holds me fast. If I say, surely darkness shall hide me, and night shall be my light. Darkness is not dark for you, and night shines as the day. Darkness and light are but one. Amen. Ratzinger says, behind this psalm and its counterparts in other religions lies a fundamental experience of man. He knows that he is known. He knows that his life lies open at every point to an act of seeing, from which there is no concealment or escape. This consciousness of being known is at the heart of what we talk about when we talk about human consciousness. The human person is conscious of being himself or herself, and so can also be conscious of being seen and known. So perhaps we can restate one part of our question and also our concern about artificial intelligence. Can a computer know that its existence and activity is open to being seen? Can it know that it is known in this deep fundamental sense? Can it experience a challenge and a call within the experience of being seen? Of course, not every human person is comfortable with being seen in this way, right? We can consider it to be antithetical to our freedom, to the ability to actualize ourselves without any boundaries. Indeed, in the second creation account, the serpent tells the woman that this seeing is a threat, right? And that it even conceals divine insecurity. It conceals God's unwillingness to give her what she should have. You certainly will not die, the serpent says. God knows well that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods who know good and evil. Will or can artificial intelligence even have the capacity to make such a choice between surrender and autonomy as Eve did? Do such categories make sense? Can they ever make sense for the work of human hands? Now, I'm going to leave these kind of questions for our presenters to answer, but also, very importantly, for us to discuss in the disputatio sessions, those of you who are on that track, where we can get together and bandy these things about and try to understand them more deeply. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is to present some important principles, theological and philosophical, that I hope can help set the stage and draw together the expansive set of presentations that will follow. Matt Rossano on ritual and human origins, Jordan Wales on AI, and Jeremy Wilkins on human wonder and reason. I'm going to be drawing from the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas some important points in his philosophical and theological anthropology that are widely misunderstood, but that have great implications for drawing together what science tells us and what faith tells us about being human. When I say these are widely misunderstood, I'm inviting you to stop me at any time, raise your hand and let me know if you have a question or if you need something repeated, right? Because I've noted in many times when I've talked about this with both students as well as general audiences, students and teachers, that some of the things that Thomas Aquinas says here strike them as quite different than what they have heard in their own catechesis and in their own theological education. So first, I'd like to talk about what it means for a human being to be a living being and a creature of flesh and blood. Science, evolutionary science, as we'll see from Matt, tells us that this is not simply a matter of our constitution, of anatomy and physiology, but a matter of history. We are animals that have evolved from other animals. Hominin evolution, indeed primate and mammalian evolution, is the rich trove from which so much of what it means to be human is drawn. Even if we could produce a robot that had a human physiology, even down to its DNA, it would not share that history with us. So as it gets more and more sophisticated, it does so only as an artifact, not as the product of a history of its own. It's really a product of the history of its inventors, its programmers. Perhaps that which many Christians fear as an atheistic fabrication, evolution and evolutionary science, can in the end prove to be a crucial ally to us as we present and propose the faith. One which can help us draw a sharp line of demarcation between ourselves and our iPhones, right? Or for that matter, our robots. This means talking about the human soul for what it is, the soul of a specific kind of animal. So I call this St. Thomas and the Soul, Part 1. Second, I'd like to talk about what it means for a human being to be a rational being and what that tells us about the human soul. Here we're going to try to tackle, but only briefly in an introduction to our other presenters, how reason distinguishes us from the other animals, but does not single us out as divided beings, as, right, kind of a weird hybrid between a ghost and a machine. It means dealing with a paradox about being human that is inextricably linked to our eternal destiny, but not without some problems that we have to tackle. I hope it also shows how or why downloading all of our neural information into a machine would not in any way be a donation of our identity or a replication of our personality. And then finally, I want to end by reflecting on the Christian doctrine of the direct or special creation of the soul. Now, those of you who are familiar with this from your past experiences probably already know that the issue of the origin of the human soul is one issue about which the Catholic Church has qualified her openness to what science has revealed about our evolutionary origins. To quote St. John Paul II, the doctrine of faith affirms that man's spiritual soul is created directly by God, hence direct or special creation. The human soul on which man's humanity definitively depends cannot emerge from matter, since the soul is of a spiritual nature. So from the theological perspective, the human difference is located in the fact that the soul is spiritual and directly created by God. It is not merely and I think that word is important, the result of a biological process, and I'll explain. In fact, this is the case for every human being. Whenever a new human being is conceived, it must involve the direct creation of the soul of that human being. So, how can we bring this doctrine into dialogue with what evolutionary science tells us about our origins? I'll take a shot at that, and then I'll conclude. Any questions? Okay. Move to the first topic. On March 7th, 1277, on the third anniversary of St. Thomas Aquinas' death, Stephen Tempier, the Archbishop of Paris, issued a condemnation of the following proposition, which I have at the top. In human beings, there is only one substantial form, namely the intellectual soul. The date was no accident, because the proposition that he condemned was from Thomas Aquinas' own teaching. It was a position that he defended vigorously throughout his theological career. The condemnation didn't stick. In fact, just 34 years later, the 19th Ecumenical Council of Vienna would condemn the opposite, right? We reject, as erroneous and contrary to the truth of the Catholic faith, every doctrine or proposition rashly asserting that the substance of the rational or intellectual soul is not of itself and essentially the form of the human body, right? So, the proposition was condemned by an archbishop, right? But then it was proclaimed by an ecumenical council. Now, this might seem like a quite technical matter, not of much interest today, but its implications are nothing less than recognizing that A, our bodies are ourselves, and that B, to be truly human is to be wholly animal. A rational animal, which is a unique and very curious kind of animal, but an animal nonetheless. For St. Thomas Aquinas, and thanks to the Council of Vienna for all Catholics, I am one living being. And this living being is animal through and through, while also being rational through and through. All right, let's explore that a little bit. What this means is that a human is not a mind connected to an animal body. And the human soul is not the human person. As St. Thomas Aquinas himself says, quite directly, ego sum non animam meam. I am not my soul. So one might wonder, what is the soul then, if it is not me? Right? What goes to heaven, for instance, before the resurrection of the body? Well, for Aquinas, a soul is nothing more than that which accounts for a thing being alive in a certain kind of way. We could call it the life principle of that living being. So, are bacteria alive? Yes. Does a bacterium have a specific kind of life? Sure. And so, in this way of explaining it, it has a bacterial soul to account for that life. And a soul is not a thing like a liver or a brain. It does not exist apart from the body, and in all cases except one, our case, it perishes with the body. So a body without a soul is no body at all. What is it? It's a corpse, right? It's a corpse, ready to be taken over as the sustenance of things that still have souls. So lions sustain themselves on the corpses of gazelles. Hawks sustain themselves on those of chickens. And vegans on the mortal remains of something called quinoa, or is it, yeah, I don't know. Yes. It's not an important word in my vocabulary, so I don't use it very often. Yeah, yeah, right. Okay, it's a C. There you go. So if I'm not a soul attached to this body that I've got or have, this means that I am a living being, a living bodily being of a certain kind. I'm body and soul in an inextricable way. And because I'm bodily, my animal heritage is important for understanding who I am. Human beings are animals, doing things in animal ways. We eat, we sleep, we have sex. Unlike angels, we are essentially world dependent, right? To stay alive, humans, like all animals, need the deaths of other forms of life that are edible. Formerly alive, but now dead matter. Humans live in ecosystems of which they are a part and with which they interact. When it is time to answer the question, what is a human, or what does it mean to be human, we should follow St. Thomas Aquinas' example and start with understanding what it means to be an animal. What it means to be an animal. And so we're starting with Matt Rossano's talk, How Ritual Made Us Human. It is extremely helpful for us, not at all a threat, that we now know that we not only are animals, but that we receive our animality from a rich history of common descent. Human animality is now much more brightly illuminated through fields such as cognitive and evolutionary psychology, which have expanded the range and accuracy of our vision of our animality, our understanding of how it works. So to dig into this trove of new knowledge does not require substantially departing from Thomas Aquinas' basic insight. On the contrary, it means to deepen it, right? Okay. So I want to stop there and see if you have any questions about this. I wrote a rather short talk because I think that some of these things might be new and want to give you a chance to ask questions. So I'm just going to sit up here and make you sit in uncomfortable silence until somebody asks me a question. That's right, exactly. Yes, ma'am.
So does that mean your soul is not unique to you?
No, it does not mean that it's not unique to you. It just means that, like the souls of all those people in the room, right, and my soul too, right, it is a particular kind of being, or count for being alive, right? It's a life principle of a particular kind. Good. How many of you are taught something that at least led you to think that the soul was you? Raise your hand. At some point or another, I've heard it spoken of that way. Raise your hand. Yeah, most everybody in the room, right? You have any questions about that, thoughts about that? Or? Jordan?
All right, so if the soul is not me, then what is the soul?
Well, I'm going to get to that in a second. Actually, I was going to wait until it was your presentation, sit in the back and raise my hand and say, and ask you that. Yeah, yes, Kyle.
This is kind of going into teacher mode for a minute, so if this is a conversation we can have later, that's fine, but I can, because I talk about this in my classes sometimes, and I can easily envision students, because I get some form of this a lot, saying, okay, what you just said about how like our souls are the only ones that will go on after we die, all the other ones cease to exist, because the kid who wants to know what happens to his dog and that sort of thing.
Right.
You know, if somebody said to you, okay, what's your evidence for saying the human soul is a different kind of soul and will go on forever and the animal soul is not?
No, that's actually the next part of my
Fantastic. You're
presentation.
welcome.
Good. Yeah, Chris.
Mine's not necessarily a question, but it was a comment that it was kind of like, at death, the body has to experience the death before resurrection.
Right.
And then the soul just sits there without a body, and it almost seems like that is a death of the soul, in a way, before we face resurrection where we are reunited.
I think that's a good way to think about it. In death, my whole person dies, right? And what is left afterwards is a corpse, right? And something I'm going to talk about more in a little while, right? But I am not my soul. Thomas says this in numerous places, right? He says in one place that Abraham is not Abraham's soul, right? Right. Well, Abraham is not Abraham. Abraham's soul is not Abraham, is what I meant to say. Pardon me. So it's still your soul, right? But it's not you. Yes, ma'am.
So in other words, full completion doesn't happen until the body is reunited?
Thank God for the last line. Right? The resurrection of the creed, the resurrection of the body and life everlasting, right? In fact, St. Thomas says that it'd be very difficult to comprehend the continued existence of the soul after death without the resurrection of the body. Right? It's not easy to understand without that doctrine why we would claim it, why we would actually say that.
Maybe this is a little more of a history question. I'm just thinking. So where has like in the modern Catholic intellectual tradition, this idea of us being more soul than body? Where are the roots of that? Like because a lot of Catholics do actually think that we are more soul than body.
Right.
Is that just the Protestantism's effect on Catholicism, or what?
I haven't given a lot of thought to that, right? I mean, Jay back there, though, has.
So, I mean, the idea has its roots in Plato, obviously, right? I mean, souls are basically, and you find this more strongly in the early Christian tradition with certain patristic figures who are more Platonistically inclined. Plato had the idea that, we're souls, we're experiencing the form, we're kind of sucked into bodies at some point, and part of his sort of epistemology is that you can recollect through sort of Socratic practice. You can recollect the acquaintance and knowledge you had when you existed with your pre-embodied existence when you were in the company of the forms. You do have, and I guess it depends on how you read. Someone like Origen has a similar kind of very strongly Platonistically inclined metaphysic, but it really becomes kind of rationalized with Descartes. Descartes, we have something where we have an account of the soul as the ground of personal identity that's taken out of a mythological frame and explained solely in terms of a sort of rational metaphysics and epistemology. And then, it's a contested tradition after that, especially with respect to Descartes. But you have it in Plato. It's always a temptation for us, I think. And then Descartes, we have a sort of a rationalist explanation.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So, how does this kind of play with the concept of medicine that one can experience brain death, but their body is kept alive through various, respirators and whatnot? Does that brain death show the absence of the soul? I mean,
That's a lively debate among Catholic philosophers, theologians, about especially bioethicists, right? How that should be understood. And I've heard a lot of very great accounts of that from both sides, and I'm not really sure that I could do them justice in explaining them. I'm not a moral theologian. I'm an immoral theologian. I'm a systematic theologian, right? And but it's a good question, I think. Yeah. This idea of being truly and physically your body is a difficult thing to understand because of the mindset that we inherit from someone like Descartes. But when you think about it, does it help you understand your salvation being offered to you through the Eucharist, through physical realities, right? Instead of perhaps through intellectual propositions, right? I think it does. And for Thomas Aquinas, the Eucharist is so central to his thought about our salvation. And you can see how that is very deeply connected to the point he's making here. Any other questions? Okay. Let's move on to the next. The Notre Dame philosophy professor, John O'Callaghan, was here speaking to the participants at Foundations Notre Dame less than 2 weeks ago. And he made reference to our animality and insisted upon it in kind of the same way that I am. But he also noted its uniqueness. Animals have sex, he said, but we do too. And unlike them, we license sex. We celebrate it by feasting at wedding ceremonies. We surround it with promises of fidelity. And we even today hold those who break marital promises accountable. Now, do other animals have mating rituals? Something like sexual customs? Absolutely. But we wouldn't call those weddings, right? No, what they produce, marriages. Man, in other words, is an animal. but one with a particular and curious difference. Now that difference between what we would call maybe animal intelligence on the one hand and human reason was well known to St. Thomas Aquinas. He ascribed to many animals a very high degree of cognitive ability, what we might call intelligence or brain power. He observed that non-human animals have the ability to learn from past experiences. Also, that they are capable of judging situations correctly, that they can learn to solve problems. St. Thomas called this natural judgment. But he maintained that the power of reason allows our species alone to make judgments about our judgments, to hold real things in our minds mentally and to come to understand them not only for how they concern us and how we might use them, but for what they are. So animals can make judgment, but as Thomas says, to pass judgments on one's own judgments belongs only to reason. So this kind of activity that he describes in this quote, in which we can stand back and understand the intrinsic nature of things, right? Even those things that are deeply subjective to us, our choices, our judgments, right? He maintained is unique among the animals we know about. But, he would argue, because we have this power, this means that the human soul can do things that are what we would call not material or immaterial, right? Not physical, perhaps. This is very hard to comprehend because everything else we do can be attributed to our physicality in some way. But when Thomas talks about this, he spends a great deal of time arguing that human reason, human knowing of this distinct, different level than the animals, is not the activity of any bodily organ, even as it depends on our bodiliness and the functioning of our bodily organs. He says, ultimately, that an organ like the brain is not and could never be what is thinking in human beings when we reason. He would say it's something that we think with. We think with our brains the way we see with our eyes. Just because the brain is the organ of thinking, just as the eye is the organ of sight. But think about the eye in this regard. In order for the eye to be the organ of sight, the act of seeing cannot be colored in any way. Imagine if your eyes got some kind of a red or purple tinge. Would the act of seeing be polluted by that? Sure, absolutely. Right? Or think about when your hands, the organs of touch, are very cold. What seems like hot water to me, who's been inside, right, seems only like warm water to you because your hands are cold and you're putting them under the sink to thaw them out, under the faucet to thaw them out. Insofar as the act of sensing some quality of things is to be successful, it needs to be undistorted by or unpolluted by those things. The act of hearing cannot make noise. If it did, we would not hear anything, right? The act of seeing cannot be colored. The act of tasting cannot have a taste. They have to be neutral, right? Focused on one aspect of the things that we're sensing. And in that way, the senses thin out reality. They thin out the realities that they transmit to us, right? How many of you have ever closed your eyes to attend to something that's being said because something in the room was distracting you? You just wanted the hearing because you were trying to, right, gather audio, not video. But Thomas says the human intellect brings all of it, all these things taken by our senses separately, back together, and does so much more. Think about a remembered sight. It is invisible to your eye. A smell you are reminded of is odorless to your nose. The form of a magnolia blossom, with its intense lemony smell and its silky petals and its bright whiteness, is in my mind determining my concept of it, coming together, these things I got from my separate senses. The form of the thing that I understand, in this case the flowering tree of the great state of Mississippi, becomes meaning in my understanding. And all kinds of concepts fill my intellect without confusion. The magnolia blossom does not fuse with the honeysuckle blossom. And I can recall them both, right? Because I have become familiar with them. If my mind were just another physical organism, or organ rather, this could not be the case, Thomas says. In other words, these things would fuse. The smells would overtake one another, the various things, and I wouldn't be able to have concepts of them in such a way that I could recall them in odorless and invisible ways. So he says the manner of existence of the human intellect must be quite different than the manner of existence of the material objects it understands and the material organs that it uses. Let me repeat that. The manner of existence of the human intellect must be quite different than the manner of existence of the material objects that it understands and the material organs that it uses. Acts of understanding, what we call reason, cannot be material acts and cannot be the acts of any material organ. The human brain does not think. It just so happens to be the material organ without which we could not think. And I think here we might see a line of demarcation between the human intellect and artificial intelligence. Human reason is not an act of thinning reality out into a ghostly idea of a magnolia blossom. Our material organs give us one piece of the magnolia reality at a time. But the human intellect thickens the data from our senses into the concept of a magnolia blossom, seeing its reality as one type, right? The blossom of a particular kind of flowering tree. It can add to that understanding of its dynamic activities of photosynthesis and self-propagation, and its reality as something that can symbolize a culture and be the subject of poetry. For instance, as I compare my daughter's complexion to a magnolia, right? In fact, that's the way I carry that memory of the magnolia blossom through the cold northern Indiana winter and remind myself that in Margaret Baglow, far away at college in Texas, I have that which the magnolia signifies, and I am grateful and content even while I freeze my ass off. There she is, by the way. And yes, that is a beer. But I want the people, so Margaret's alma mater as representatives here. So this was not taken during high school. This was taken 3 days ago in Krakow, Poland, where she's legal. Okay, anyway. Somewhere in this mysterious process of sensing and of the intellect drawing these things together into concept, the human mind takes flight. It starts with physical sensing, and everything we know depends on our senses. But quickly, it rises to universal concepts that transcend the senses. And this is why we have a rational counterpart to the doctrine of faith, that there is an existence that occurs immediately after death, and not just in the resurrection of the body, right? The human soul, because it is not reducible to materiality, remains in existence after the body dies, right? Because the human mind can do things that no physical organ, including the brain, can do, right? We also then have to note that something that has certain powers must have a certain being, right? And a being that transcends materiality would require, right, at least, or open the possibility at least, of a continued existence after the death of the body. Yeah, I know, that's very complex. So are there any questions? Please don't raise your hand and say, what? No, yes.
Pete, one thing you said the matter and blank, I didn't get what blank was. The matter and blank must be quite different from what is perceived and how it is perceived. Can you just repeat that statement?
The intellect must be quite different.
Thank you. Thank you.
The manner of existence, not the matter, but the
Right.
manner of existence of the human intellect must be quite different than the manner of existence of the material objects it understands.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Rafi.
Okay, so I'm trying to get this question in my head. How do we use this to kind of to dialogue with, particularly this idea of, because we have this idea within our philosophy of degrees of consciousness, degrees of being, right? And my limited reading of science shows that we do have in biology evidence that there is degrees of knowing that exist within animals, right? Like
Yeah.
the way that an octopus thinks vastly more complex and more aware than that of, like, let's say, a cat. So how do we put this in dialogue with what a lot of science is saying, that consciousness and knowledge seems to increase with complexity, while we're
Right.
saying, okay, but there's a jump that happens with humanity. How do we dialogue with that?
Well, I would say that there's both a difference of degree and in kind. The difference of degree can be located in the physical constitution of a human being, particularly the human brain, right? Although we know so little about the brain that it's hard to know exactly where and how. There's a lot of development that's going on with that right now. But that somehow this is also a difference of kind, right? And that's why the third topic that I'm going to talk about is what we call the direct creation or the special creation of the human soul, which seems quite in contrast with science, but I hope to actually offer an explanation that can kind of show how the two can come into a fruitful synthesis. Right? Yeah. Not a synthesis that can be reached within science, however. Right? It requires philosophy and theology to get there. Philosophy, at least, the theology can help fill that out. Okay, so the important thing here is to follow back the steps again, which I'm just going to repeat briefly. We see that in order for the senses to do their jobs, which is to give us one piece of something that we are encountering, right? A magnolia blossom was my example, right? They need to basically thin reality out. They need to give us this piece, that piece, etc. But the human intellect does more than just simply bring all that together into a concept, right? It can also go beyond that concept into universal application, into deeper understanding, into metaphysical reflection, and even into things like poetry, literature, right? The symbolism of a culture. And this is something that, Thomas Aquinas argues, shows that, as I said before, the manner in which the intellect exists cannot be the same as the organs that give the intellect access to reality. Okay. I'll leave Margaret up there for a while. A material process cannot produce a reality that transcends it, at least not on its own, right? It can only offer what it has. And so biological evolution cannot be the only word on what it means to be human. And yet, no explanation of what it means to be human can set it aside. So how can we have both? That seems to be Rafi's question. How can we have both evolutionary biology and Catholic theological anthropology? How do we bring them into dialogue? I think that one way to ask the question is to look at it from this angle. How does God directly create a human soul? In our ordinary way of thinking, it's easy to imagine that whenever a human body is made, God makes a soul for that body, right? Kind of attaching the two. My colleague, Corey Hayes, talks about the soul canon, right? So there's all these human conceptions going on out there, and God's up in heaven with a soul cannon. You know, shooting souls into bodies, attaching souls to bodies, right? Embedding souls into bodies. But many mistakenly think of themselves as two things: a living body and a mysterious ghost that is the real self. And as we have already said, however, this is to misunderstand the nature of the soul, which is not a separate thing that God makes, but along with the matter from which our body is made, is one of two principles that make a human being a living being. It's one of two principles that make a living being a human being a living being. No part of us is simply soul. No part of us is merely body. In fact, a body without a soul is not a body at all. Remember, a body without a soul is a corpse, and I am not my soul. So what are we to say then about this uniqueness that we find in human beings? Well, at the beginning of our species, and indeed at the beginning of every human life, at every conception, we have a paradox, but not a contradiction. From one perspective, human beings are the natural product of primate evolution, the product of a meandering process that involved trends we see in other hominins: bigger brains, more sophisticated tools in social organization, right? Animal cultures, social learning. These are all things that animals do, right? From the other perspective, each human being is a rational and spiritual being, the product of God's loving initiative that engages each of us in a special relationship with our Creator. This is what has been called the direct or special creation of the human soul. And one way to think about it is offered to us by the International Theological Commission in a way that I think sheds light on the paradox without necessarily dissolving it. That God can bring about effects that transcend the capacity of created causes acting according to their natures, in which God directly causes the soul in a non-disruptive way. Think about the healing of the blind man at the pool of Siloam. Do you guys remember that? I forget which gospel it's in at the moment. Jesus makes paste with saliva, right, and mud. And then what does he do? He puts it on his eyes, right? Now, he uses a natural agent to bring about a cause that certainly transcends what that cause can bring about on its own, right? Don't ever go to an eye doctor who wants to cure your nearsightedness by spitting in some dirt and putting it in your eyes, right? But in this particular case, these natural causes, the water, the saliva, the mud, brings about something that water, saliva, and mud don't normally do, don't normally bring about. Perhaps we could think about the direct creation of the human soul in the same way. Human souls do come from parents through the fertilization of the female ovum by the male sperm. Human parents are the created causes, looking at the quote, that acting according to their sexual natures. What makes human reproduction different is that rather than disrupting this process and kind of intervening from it outside, into it from the outside with a soul cannon, God causes that process to produce a life principle that transcends what an ordinary biological process of sexual reproduction can produce. Okay? In other words, God uses sex to bring about an animal that is also rational and has a soul that cannot be reduced to pure materiality. Now, this is the exact words that are used by the International Theological Commission to describe the direct creation of the human soul. There are also words that can easily be used to describe a miracle. Right? But we need to make an important exception here, because the human soul is not to be, the direct creation of the human soul is not to be understood as a miracle in the strict theological sense. Miracles are singular one-time events. The healing of the blind man at the pool of Siloam, it doesn't happen again for the next person that comes along, right, who's blind and happens to be in the vicinity. The direct creation of the human soul happens in the ordinary course of nature, whenever human sexual reproduction is successful in the normal course of nature. Is it more like a miracle than other natural events? In some way it can, because it can be described in words that could also describe a miracle, right? And also because natural causes, mom and dad, are empowered to produce something beyond their capacity, right? The process of sexual reproduction is brought about in such a way that its effect transcends itself. This, by the way, is the way that Joseph Ratzinger, a long time ago, 1972, right? I was only 4 years old then. But anyway, he was already thinking about these kind of things and trying to understand this doctrine, the direct creation of the human soul, from the perspective of evolution. He says this: if creation means dependence of being, then special creation is nothing more than special dependence of being. The statement that man is created in a more specific, more direct way by God than other things in nature, when expressed somewhat less metaphorically, means simply this: that man is willed by God in a specific way, not merely a being that is there, but as a being that knows him, not only as a construct that he thought up, but as an existence that can think about him in return. We call the fact that man is specifically willed and known by God his special creation. I don't have this quote up here, the rest of the quote up here, but I'll give it to you as well. The clay became man at that moment, in which a being for the first time was capable of forming, however dimly, the thought God. For it is not the use of weapons or fire, not new methods of cruelty or of useful activity that constitute man, but rather his ability to be immediately in relation to God. The theory of evolution does not invalidate faith, nor does it corroborate it. But it does challenge faith to understand itself more profoundly, and thus to help man to understand himself and to become increasingly what he is, the being who is supposed to say thou to God in eternity. Right. So in summary, the human soul, the very life principle that makes a human body to be a living animal body of a specific kind, is not a thing that God makes separately. Rather, due to the free unfolding of a universe that he sustains in being precisely for this purpose, a body of the human kind is, of its essence, a body that must have a spiritual soul to be the kind of creature that it is. A body that, and this is very poetic and inexact, but quite beautiful, that in the words of the 17th century Catholic philosopher John of St. Thomas, quote, calls out to God out of justice for a rational soul. The spiritual soul, the rational soul, is the principle that, with the body, makes a human being this kind of living animal being. Evolution, according to the God-given laws of the universe, and due to the activity of creatures over millions of years, has yielded a situation where, in our universe, there is now a material creature for whom to be spiritual is its natural state, us, whose origins implicate God and require his direct involvement. And this wonderful mystery about us reveals a truth that science could never discover, but which faith and reason together can discern. That we human beings are the ultimate reason for why the universe exists. The point of God's creative activity. From all eternity, God did not merely will to share his goodness with creatures, but he willed for there to be a creature that could receive the gift of the created universe and ultimately the gift of his own divine life. In the words of St. John Paul II, creation is a gift because man appears in it, who, as an image of God, is able to understand the very meaning of the gift in God's call from nothing to existence. Man appears in creation as the one who received the world as a gift. And vice versa, one can also say that the world has received man as a gift. So the created universe could not be a gift. A gift requires both a giver and one who receives a gift, right? The created universe could not be a gift unless there was a creature who, being capable of understanding, could wonder at its beauty, respond to it with delight, begin to comprehend its laws, its patterns, right? And then to bless God for this reality. The human difference, the paradox of special creation, lies precisely in this uniquely human capacity which places us in an intimate relationship with the Trinity, who calls us into being out of nothingness and then calls out to us in love, as the International Theological Commission puts it. And this human difference finds its culmination in the Eucharist, right? In which symbol and reality become one, and in which our most centered moment of consciousness at Holy Communion becomes an openness to the one who sees us. Give a computer access to every security camera in every church in the world, and it will not see the Eucharist. Because the Eucharist can only be seen with the eyes of faith. Because its greatness consists in that it contains the whole Christ, head and members. Okay, I think I'm running out of time here. I have more, but why don't I stop there and open it up for questions? So thank you. Yes.
Okay, when you went back to the part about the soul during conception and sexual intercourse being the natural process of which humans are created, where do you go with this when the kids bring in things like IVF?
Mhm.
So because, you know, the actual human was created, the soul is,
Well, that's why I said whenever sexual reproduction is successful.
okay, so just reproduction, okay.
Yeah. If it produces a human being, right? Then, yeah. Regardless of whether or not that's a moral way of producing a human being, right? So we can set that question to one side, right? But if it produces something like us, it produces the image of God. In much the same way, if E.T. ever shows up, then he's the image of God too, or she, right? Because it's precisely in our ability to reason, our ability for freedom, our capacity for communion, and all the things that are based on those, that we image God. Matt.
Okay, could you complete this sentence for me?
I'll try.
You've said a number of times, and I understand this. You say a body without a soul is a corpse.
Yeah.
Is it possible to go the other way and say a soul without a body is,
Yeah.
what is it?
It is not ourselves, something that is trapped in a state that, if being a corpse as a spiritual counterpart, is something like that. But at the same time is capable of being still, like, for instance, drawing upon its store of memories, right? But Thomas Aquinas would say it's kind of frozen in that state, right? This is why the particular judgment, right, is understood by him as that moment where the soul lies completely open. All of the decisions that have been made, all of its experiences, right? All of those things, right, now stand before God transparently and cannot change. The script of the life that has ended remains the same, but it can't be continued, right? And that's one of the hardest things in all of this for me to understand, what that would be like.
Okay, and just one more idea to help make sure I understand this. And I've heard you and Corey discuss this many times.
Yes.
Each time I try to remember how I understand it.
Right.
Okay, is it not the case, if body and soul, if soul depends on body so intimately as you're describing it,
Right.
Aquinas described, then isn't it the case that the human soul is developing right along with the body? It's not in its mature form, you might say, in a 1-year-old.
That's right.
A 5-year-old.
Sure. No. I think that's absolutely the case.
So somebody could have a stunted soul by virtue of
Well,
environmental factors, and so just like you have a stunted body.
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, although I don't want to dwell on them in separate ways that way. It's not like the soul is being stunted, right, and the body is being stunted. The living human being is being stunted, right? And what continues after death, right, has a stunted sort of reality in regard to that, perhaps. Yeah.
And the soul is basically just the yearning and the ability to understand God. Could we say that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Jay's supposed to be bringing around the microphone. But we'll keep rolling with this one.
Okay.
I think it's more than, I think that, I mean, in its most foundational reality, yes. But that it's also the ability to come to know and understand other persons, the world, right? That it's precisely being this kind of being, right, that allows us a unique way of being in the world.
Because your understanding of God is in very many ways mediated through your relationships with
Sure.
others and your understanding of the universe and of
Right.
nature and all those sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Carl, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
With regard to this idea of the soul and the body, and neither one is completely us, like I get that, like I'm on board with what you're saying as far as, you know, if I die today, I mean, hopefully not, but if I die today, my soul, let's say, I mean, let's put a happy ending on it, my soul goes to heaven.
Yeah.
Like, I get that that's not all of me yet, because it's not the general resurrection, but at the same time, what do we say about that? Because I wouldn't, like, my body's in a lot worse situation at that point than my soul is, because my soul could be already in the beatific vision. So what's sort of the thing that's lacking? Because I'm not envisioning my soul would be in heaven thinking like, yeah, this is pretty good, but it won't really take off till my body gets here.
Yeah. Well, no, I think heaven is wonderful, even prior to the resurrection of the body, right? Beyond what we can comprehend. So, let's see.
Like I'm trying to wrap my head around the part of that there's sort of something lacking, which I get, because I'm not all there yet in my body.
Right.
But what is, like, I wouldn't feel like my soul is dead or sort of imprisoned without my body, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know if
Yeah.
the church has sort of spilled any official ink on this, or if it's sort of speculative, but I'm trying to resolve.
We have a
what would
communion
that
with
be?
God in the humanity of Christ, which is risen and glorified, right? And so consequently, within that body, right, we are able to praise and worship God, love Him and love one another, right? But not yet in that full way, which would involve, right, whatever the resurrected glorified body is like, which we just don't know. Although it seems pretty clear there's going to have to be, first of all, a point of actual identity, so it's going to be our bodies, right? And in a sense, you can say that the soul provides that itself, because, right, the soul is the form of the body. So the matter of our bodies is formed in a specific way by our souls, right? It makes me 6'4" and my cousin Brian 7'2". Right? I'm actually a short male in my family. You know, those kinds of things, right? Their reunion then is going to involve something new, but because we can't understand the first state or the second state, how that would be the case, we just simply have to leave to, you know, leave to eternity to find out. Yes.
So are you saying that because God made souls specifically to give us a certain type of life, that when it doesn't have something to give life to, it's in stasis?
What Aquinas describes as something like stasis. Now that's reason trying to penetrate the reality of what it would mean to have a soul that exists after death, right? But the Christian tradition has given a more beautiful picture of this, as I said before in regard to, and just now in regard to Carl's question, that it's precisely in our communion with Christ in His glorified and risen body, right, that we exist and await the resurrection of our own. So, what that would be, what that means, would be hard to understand, is kind of hard to understand. I try to understand it by analogy to the greatest moments of intimacy and communion in this life. That is, those moments in which I have true friendship, right? True love, right? In which our participation kind of becomes a unique unity with another person, right? Or the soul with God in prayer would be perhaps an even better way of thinking about it. But somehow in what we call the intermediate state, between the death of the body and the resurrection, we dwell in Christ, right, and share in his risen and glorified humanity while we await the resurrection of our bodies. But I don't know what that will be like. That's all I can say, but I don't think anyone does, right?
If we could go, we'll go past his sister, and then we'll go Brother Homer, Brother Wales, Brother Rafi.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, I have an anthropological question for you.
Okay.
When you're speaking of the human person as the imago Dei,
Mhm.
are you referencing Homo sapiens, who has the ability to think symbolically, or all of the species of the genus Homo?
Well, I mean, it would depend. We only know a certain amount about those.
Right.
And Matt's going to teach us a lot more, right? So I don't want to go too far into it. But I will say this. If this difference could be ascribed to any other embodied creature, we would call them the image of God too. Right?
Right.
So it's precisely what I described here. Is it conceivable that other members of the genus Homo achieve this? Sure. Right? People can argue about whether or not we've discovered that they were, right? That's different. But there's certainly the case that, like I said about E.T., right? That it's precisely in this kind of being an animal that we have the image of God. Yeah. All right. Who's going next?
Pass it to Chris Culver.
I was wondering, is there any revelation or conversation about the resurrection of the body for those who go to hell?
Yeah, that we all rise, right? Some to everlasting life and others to everlasting judgment.
Okay.
That's right. So whether or not we go to hell or heaven, right, is a matter that concerns God and us, right, in terms of particular individuals. But that, in any case where someone would be condemned, right, or where I like to rather think it would condemn themselves precisely by cutting themselves off from God, right, resurrection of the body would apply to them too. Catechism has a nice statement about that if you want to check it out. Someone else over here?
Yes, we got Jordan, then we got Rafi. Jeff, was that a
Jeff had his hand up, yeah.
All right, so hit you after Rafi.
I just wanted to offer a comment maybe on the stasis.
Yeah.
And on the way Aquinas talks about it. I'm not an expert on Aquinas, but I know a few things about this. But I make no guarantees as to my description. That out of the way, the way Aquinas talks about the soul in heaven is that when we think of ourselves as active, as initiating acts, like I'm speaking right now, we get up, we eat coffee, drink coffee or something, I'm still a little tired. Anyway, the initiation of discrete acts by us as human beings requires the encounter with discrete images of the world. And we have to have the ability to have a thought that begins and ends in the initiation of a new thought. All of this depends upon our brain and our sense organs. And so what is left, I'm just going to say what is left of me and not worry too much about the grammar of whether it's I or not. But anyway, what is left of me with my soul, when I don't have my body, I can't engage in discrete thoughts anymore. I can only have one thought, really, or one act, and that's the single act of cleaving to God in the beatific vision. And so, in a way, God supplies himself. The way Aquinas talks about the beatific vision is God directly joins the intellect to himself such that, I don't remember the technical term, but it's almost like God becomes the thought that we think. Instead of us having a thought about God, God becomes the thought that we think. There's this kind of direct encounter. And so in the absence of the brain, in the absence of images, we have the single all-at-once beatific vision. And so if we're talking about stasis here, it's not stasis like an ice cube.
Right.
It's stasis like a laser beam, fully in act to the full degree of our capacity as actuated by this encounter with God. And so then the only acts, you could say, that come and go in this state after death but before the resurrection would be moments of prayer. But intriguingly, when, like Aquinas asked the question, well, how can Peter pray for me if Peter doesn't have individual thoughts? Well, Peter can pray for me if I ask Peter to pray for me, because God supplies Peter with the kind of, with me as a particular object of the single act of love by which Peter exists in this beatific existence.
Right.
So you can have the communion of saints interceding and everything, but it's not news to God that they're interceding, because he's actually making it possible for their single act of love to be joined to this particular intention. So just a thought about the stasis. The stasis is a sense of the stasis is like it's like the laser beam rather than the ice cube or the rock. But anyway, that's all I had.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you.
So we'll go Rafi, Jeff, any takers after the Rafi? Would you mind passing that? Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, that actually might have answered my question already, and I ask it anyways. So the way we're speaking about soul, would it be appropriate to draw an equal sign between the soul and what normally is spoken about as consciousness? And if it is, or rather, if it's not, if we're going to speak of consciousness as something that only happens, right, when the soul and the body are together, then, and again, that thing Jeremy answered it, then can a soul be conscious without the body? Like, if the soul is consciousness, or how would you differentiate if it's not? If you don't say they're the same, then how do you differentiate between soul and consciousness? And if it is, can the soul be conscious without its body?
Good question. Jeremy's going to answer it. See, this is why I surround myself with really brilliant people, because then I get paid, but they get to answer all the questions.
Well, you answered it in a way, because you you pointed out that the soul is the life principle, and so there's a kind of soul that's appropriate to every kind of organism that has its internal life principle, and some of those organisms don't, as far as I can tell, seem to be present to themselves in their presence to the world, like the development of an oak tree or something like that. There doesn't seem to be this kind of concomitant self-presence that's part of the oak tree's presence to the world. And that's true for a lot of processes that are happening in us too. So part of the thing is the soul is the principle of your development as a human being, but your development as a human being is across different levels, right? You're developing organically, and you're developing in your sensorium, and you're also developing intellectually and morally. And the soul is remotely operating all of that stuff, right? So, but a lot of it's happening unconsciously. I went to sleep last night. I woke up this morning, my beard was longer than it was yesterday, so I was very cheered by that. And that kind of thing happens unconsciously. But some stuff obtrudes into consciousness when it becomes necessary to deal with it. So I woke up early this morning. My arm had fallen asleep because of the way I was lying on it, right? And that was a thing that was really happening with my organism, but it was trouble. And so it obtruded itself into my consciousness, and I woke up. I became present to it in a conscious way because I needed to move to get circulation to my arm. So there are levels at which the thing that you are is conscious, right? And there are levels below that where processes are happening that are not conscious. So you have to think of the soul as the principle that's operating all of that. But the thing about the separability of the soul, and this is, I mean, Chris was talking about this and Jordan was mentioning it too a little bit, is that there is something that's happening in us at the highest level when we're asking and answering questions and exploring the world and so forth, it is moving beyond just the restrictions of the limited time and space that we're in, right? So my dog is conscious, present to its world, but the dog's consciousness is its sensorium. The dog's world is the world that corresponds to its sensorium. It has the world by nose and mouth. But you have your world by questions. And there's a way in which there's something going beyond time and space there. But if I say too much more than that, I'll just eat up my whole talk for tomorrow. And then, then what will I do?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Well, we'll have another shot.
Jeff.
Right. So I'm still thinking about this the separation of the soul from the body question that Carl had asked earlier, and I think, Jordan, I think you said it far more eloquently than I was thinking it, but for me, the question of what a disembodied soul endures in heaven before it receives the resurrection of the body is only a question if we conceive of time in heaven as time exists here, right? But if upon the separation of my soul from my body, my soul leaves time, then in essence, if we think of time as a line, don't all souls leave the timeline at the same time? In other words, if heaven is outside of the line of created time, then aren't we all getting to heaven at the same time in a sense? And so aren't we all getting to the resurrection of the body at the same time? Right? So is there a passage of time at all between the particular judgment and the final judgment and the resurrection of the body? Or is it just simply a rendering of the soul from the body and then the ultimate reunification of the resurrected body to that disembodied soul, all in one kind of series of events?
Well, so what is time? I mean, it's an awareness of change by a consciousness, by a mind, right? And we could talk about the contents of what happens in time, right? So in this time that we experience now, things are in constant flux. Jeremy's beard is growing as we speak. Getting more and more Rip Van Winkle-esque. You have this, the whole kind of, you're right, all of these things are going on. People's minds are getting tired. People's brains are getting tired, right, from this. Or you're getting tired of sitting. There's all of this flux that goes on for an embodied creature. When the soul is not embodied, right, it can still experience change. Otherwise, purgatory would not make any sense, right? So when we talk about eternity, we don't mean we go into a state in which there is no change whatsoever. But would it certainly be different than the time as we experience it now? I think that's the case for sure. But I don't think it would be right to say that we all show up at the second coming altogether, right? As if just at the moment of death, right? That's the next thing we experience. Because there is purgatory, because there is these acts of prayer that the saints make on our behalf, right? There are changes that occur. We participate in God's eternity, but there's no entering eternity, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to say, when is my first moment of God's perfect now, right? As if I would somehow have that for myself, right? Because then there would be a beginning to it, and it would not, by definition, be without beginning or end, a perfect present, a perfect now. What we have is our participation in divine eternity, and that's what we call eternal life. Is that helpful? All right, great.
So we should probably, are we finishing at 9:45?
Well, we're supposed to finish at 10, and then we have a half an hour break, which means
Heck yeah.
I can take more questions, or you can have a longer break. Either way.
Any takers?
All right, so in the Disputatio session, we'll be talking about this, and we can bring up more questions. So if they come to your mind over the break, we'll have an opportunity to continue to explore this. And of course, a lot of what I said at the beginning is about setting the stage for our other presenters. So I just wanted to get our minds going on these things and not answer too many questions, but just give us a framework within which we can receive all of the great stuff they have for us. So thank you very much.